wine country, God is good all the time. And I'm here today to cover another 5 fermenting related questions. And keep in mind, I actually have a series called an FAQ series where I get frequently asked questions, and then in each video is either answering 1 or maybe 2 questions as long as they're related to the same topic. So I'll link to the FAQ series and any other related videos that I think you will find helpful, including my vinegar playlist and my fermenting playlist. So let's get to these questions. Now the first one was, and this was a new question to me, and it had to do with somebody was very concerned because they had wine fermenting, and they had found, when they went back to check on it, they found that the water in their airlock had completely evaporated. And somewhere along the way, they had heard that if your wine is ever exposed to oxygen, it's going to go bad. But that's just simply not true. What happens with wine when it gets oxygen exposure, usually it'll be fine for a little while, but over time what will happen is if the oxygen exposure is continued, it will turn to vinegar. But it doesn't go bad, it just turns into a different useful item. So as long as it's still in the sweet phase, when you discover that your airlock has lost all the water, simply refill the airlock and put it back on there. Just make sure you taste the wine first. If it's already started to turn sour like vinegar, then I recommend putting it in a jar or a couple of jars and just putting a cloth over it and let it finish going to vinegar if you think it's something that is just not going to taste good to use as a wine. And that right there is the main difference between making wine and vinegar. They both, when started from scratch, can take 30 days for them to finish, but one, vinegar, requires you to expose it to oxygen at least in the last 2 weeks for it to turn to vinegar, where wine, you need to deprive it from oxygen exposure so that it does not turn to vinegar. Main differences right there. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell when it comes to that. So if you've lost all the water in your airlock, it's good to keep it top, always keep it right to here when you fill it. But if that ever happens, don't worry about it, just taste it and see where it's at. Then you'll know which will be the best way to go with it at that point. Now another question I've covered specifically when it comes to vinegar, but this can happen with many different ferments, is you might get something that forms on top. There are several different things that you can get forming on top. It could simply be a SCOBY, which you're going to find most commonly on top of your vinegar and on top of your kombuchas, which kombucha is basically just vinegar depending on how far you let it go. And they're totally safe. A couple other totally safe things can be cam yeast, which is kind of more in a powdery form. It doesn't lend to the best taste and smell, but a lot of times you can remove that when the process is all done, strain it through a fine cloth, and then it will be fine. But if it's, let's say it's something like vinegar and the taste, it did alter the taste of the whole vinegar, then you can simply use that vinegar for cleaning or adding to your chicken's water or dog's water if they don't mind the flavor. It's totally harmless. And then another thing, especially found in vinegar, that you can find floating on top might look like little white bits. People always automatically assume it's going to be mold. It's less likely it's mold. And those little white bits, especially when you're talking about using a whole fruit or the skins of fruit, can be the natural wax layer that a lot of your fruits form. And it just separates from the outer layer of the fruit and floats to the top. Totally harmless. And again, a lot of these things can simply be filtered out. And then another one I've also done a separate video on is, why won't my vinegar or my wine or my whatever ferment you're doing at the time, maybe you're making a fermentation starter, and why won't it bubble? Why has nothing happened? Maybe it's been, typically your ferments will start to bubble within anywhere, it could be as little as 2 days if it's in a very warm place, or it could take 4 or 5 days before it starts to bubble. But past that point, it's very likely something is wrong. And the 3 main things it could be is the type of water you're using. If you're using city tap water straight from the tap, then it's likely the chlorine. Chlorine will kill the bacteria and yeast that's required to get your items to ferment. So if you're having to use tap water, make sure that you dechlorinate the water first. What I used to do before we started collecting rainwater, and I use that instead, is that I would put the water in jugs and cover them with a cloth and let the chlorine naturally evaporate out. That I would leave for 3 days because of the smaller opening of the jugs, but if you're using a more open container, it might only take a day. A somewhat faster method, which can also be more thorough, is to simply boil the water. I think if I remember correctly, it's about 10 minutes. But then before using it to ferment anything, especially before you add any kind of starter to it, you need to make sure the water has cooled to room temperature before you start to make your wine, vinegar, kimchi, or whatever it is that you're fermenting. And then another question is, do I really have to use sugar when I make vinegar or wine? And the answer is yes. And the same thing goes with mead, but what you're using in mead is honey. That's what sets it apart from every other wine, is that you're using honey as a sugar source. To make a good vinegar or a good wine, it must have a true sugar added to it. The two I recommend the most are going to be raw honey or organic cane sugar. You don't want to use a high mineral sugar such as molasses. You can add some, but if you use all or mostly molasses or even coconut sugar, the high mineral content of these sugars can actually prevent a good ferment, because too many minerals do actually interfere with a fermenting process. So that's why I always go with organic cane sugar or honey. Now, for those of you who are asking this question because you're either keto or you're just trying to avoid sugar altogether, or you're diabetic, well, you have to understand that when it comes to vinegar in particular, for it to truly be vinegar, and once it's fully done, there is no sugar left in it. But you need the sugar to get to the vinegar. So the fermenting process in all three of these, wine, mead, and vinegar, actually eats the sugar. The sugar is what feeds the ferment, and that's where you get all that bubbly action that at some point is going to turn to alcohol. And if left exposed to oxygen at that point, will then turn to vinegar. So you need sugar. You cannot use non-nutritive sweeteners in place of sugar, because all you're going to end up with is a sweet product that probably didn't ferment. You need the sugar. And then when it comes to wine and mead, how much sugar remains in the end depends on when you stop the process. If you let it go all the way to the end to where it's completely alcohol and it's not sweet, there's no sugar left. If you want a little bit of sweetness, you stop the process a little earlier and you get some fizziness and some sweetness. And yes, there'll still be some sugar, but not much at that point. Very little, in fact. And then the last question is actually going to be two, and that is, can I use dried goods to ferment with? And the answer is yes. In fact, I did a video on that as part of the Fermented February collaboration, which I'll also link to separately down below. But I have made vinegars, natural sodas, and even kimchi using all dehydrated goods. And so yes, you can use dried goods. And the question that will likely go right along with that, do you have to rehydrate them first? Well, no. You can soak these things for a while first, but I never do, because you're already adding liquid to the ferment anyway. So when I made the kimchi, for instance, I filled the jar up, I think about halfway, or maybe a little more than halfway, with the dried goods, and then topped it off with water. At the time, I was just making an estimate of how much the dried goods would soak up the water, and I wanted to make sure there was plenty of space for them to get fully rehydrated during the fermenting process, rather than packing the jar and not have them be fully hydrated. Now, when I do that again using the dried goods, I'm going to fill that at least 3/4 of the way full of the dried goods, then add the water, because I ended up with a lot more liquid at the end than I normally do when I make a batch of fresh kimchi like I have here. And you're probably wondering, why does that kimchi look like that? You see that color? Well, that is because this is actually a new experiment, and I can't wait to try it. It's got another couple days before it's ready, because I just started it yesterday. And a couple of these items I've actually made kimchi out of by themselves, such as calendula flowers and also nasturtium flowers and leaves. But in this one, I also added some daylily flowers and then mixed them all together because I've never done calendula and nasturtium kimchi before. So it's a combination of the three, but also using the leaves from the nasturtium. And you can also use the leaves from your calendula and even your daylilies as well. And then, of course, I still added some onions and some pepper. This is a ground pepper from my garden, as well as red pepper flakes I get from Azure Standard, and some garlic that actually was already fermented. And anyway, I'm really anxious to try this to see how all of them taste together. And the daylilies will be a completely new one for me to try in the ferment. But mostly the daylilies were all pink. And so the color, even just overnight, that's one right there, the pink from the daylilies has already infused into the water, but also that color is coming from the nasturtium and calendula flowers, as well as the red pepper. So that's what's happening here, and I'll be doing a separate video just on this if you're curious to learn how I made it. It's, you know, just like any other kimchi, the way I do it. And by the way, you'll find in that fermenting playlist my brine-free kimchi recipe. So I make it basically the same way. And then I'll also be doing a video down the road on cucumber kimchi, which is just going to have a slight difference in the fact that you want to try to keep the cucumbers crisp for a longer period of time. And I share what I do with that to keep those cucumbers crisp. So yes, you can use dried goods. The only thing that I found does not ferment well is frozen goods. You can still get them to ferment, but they don't ferment as well as dehydrated, freeze-dried, or fresh. So if you're fermenting anything using frozen goods, whether you're making wine, because I make wine from my grapes that I freeze because it makes it easier to press the juice out, or vinegar, or even making some kind of kimchi, then in that case you really do need to add some kind of starter, because something happens in the freezing process that prevents it from really getting going. It's like it kills the bacteria that is needed to get a good ferment. So adding something that's got a live culture, be it whey or the fermentation starter, which I have several videos out on, that's the number one thing I use in every ferment, except for vinegar. I don't usually use it in vinegar. I just don't bother. But if I'm using frozen goods to make a vinegar, then I will add the fermentation starter to that. I love it. I use it for so many things. I've even used it in making bread, fermenting eggs, and so much more. And again, if you check out the fermenting playlist, you can find all the videos I have on these topics in there, and there's quite a number of videos in there. Well, I hope you enjoyed my second installment on 5 fermenting related questions, and any more questions you have, please put them in comments down below and I will cover them in another video very similar to this. And thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.